Welcome back to another episode of the Python People podcast, the home for global technology leaders to share insights with the tech community. And a warm welcome to this week's guest, Paulo Coelho Mendes. How was my accent, Paulo? Was that good? A good pronunciation?
Good. Yeah, no, can't fault that.
Take that, brilliant. So Paulo, yeah, welcome and thanks for coming. Thanks for coming to be with us here today. So you are a data leader. I think also a bit of a serial entrepreneur in terms of some of the ventures that you've been part of founding. And I think you've had a really interesting story throughout your journey with data. So I'd like to start, as I always do, just by asking you to kindly give us a little bit about your background and your career bio to date, and yeah, we can go from there.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Guy, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me over. It's a pleasure to be here. Great. So right now I'm the head of data science at Solved Europe. Solved Europe is an IPG health company. So its whole reason is to really kind of deliver maximum value with each interaction for all of the healthcare community. So that means HCPs, patients, researchers, pretty much everybody. Data, of course, plays an important part in that vision. That's where I come in. But as you probably listeners can tell from my accent, I'm not from around here. I'm originally from Brazil. That's where my story begins. I say what the path that brought me here can be summed up in three different stages. So the first one was really kind of late 90s, early aughts. Internet was the shiny new thing. I was fresh off college and went straight into a few startups at the time, which was great because it was a mess. It was the Wild West, and we really could do a bit of everything. So I was barely 20, 21, and I was really kind of leading CMS development because we didn't have the off-the-shelf platforms and solutions. I was trying, to design interaction, UX, so it was a bit of everything. That lasted until I left AOL Latin America. So that's after I spelled with the products, I got onto the responsibility to deal with business intelligence as well. And that was my path towards strategy, which was, I think, the main chunk of my career, my formative years. So did a bit of that for pretty much everything: digital marketing, CRM, traditional advertising. But I never let my passion for data slide, in a sense. I was always really kind of making sense of all the information around us, whether that's qualitative, quantitative, running diagnosis, this kind of thing. So I set up a few departments trying to integrate offline and digital worlds at the time. Towards early 10s, I finally got back. I mean, I was a planning partner at Almap BBDO, so large advertising network. And that's when I went back to data products and really kind of thinking about automating some of the tasks we had, getting more out of information that was flowing through the organization, this kind of thing. Eventually, I took a sabbatical. That's a major inflection point. Came to Scotland for a master's. It was really had nothing to do with my career up to that point. So it was on biology of language. What I was really interested in is how does a system like the brain implement and manipulate knowledge, right? And that kind of has informed my path from that moment on. So I ended up staying in Scotland on a T1 visa. That's for entrepreneurial graduates. I founded my business, Serendipity Lab, and set out to develop data products, tackle real world business problems, specifically messy problems, like open-ended problems. Clients would come and say, where do I expand my business to? Or where do I find, I don't know, high earning single moms, this kind of thing. So which is kind of easy for us to ask, but it's not really trivial for us to answer, as you know well. And I started developing solutions for that. Started working for some ad hoc, especially during the pandemic, some consulting on the side as well. Developed a financial health index for Brazil. And eventually that led me to IPG Health. Now at Solved, we are really kind of working closely to omnichannel, so building solutions for omnichannel orchestration. There are loads of solutions. It's really about how you integrate and how you govern data. I think those are our main challenges there. And the other bit is, how do we really capture all the knowledge, again, flowing the organization, especially qualitative ones. So we're working very closely with behavioral science and building a hybrid system so we can really kind of use automation to help our consultants' expertise. I hope it was not too long. I didn't write too much.
Great intro, and yeah, covered off a lot of good ground there. So yeah, what I really like about your background is, and I know from our sort of first meetings, clearly you're interested in solving problems, right? And like I say, big kind of open-ended problems, and I can totally understand how you've sort of gone down that strategic route. But what first attracted you to I guess technology and data, and kind of marrying data together with the strategy piece? Yeah, how did you first sort of develop your interest in the tech and data space?
I think I see that as a continuum, to be honest, because data is really about, I don't think data is just out there in nature. So it's not a thing in itself. It's really about a story. So whenever I see any kind of data point, again, whether it's qualitative, somebody talking to you on an in-depth interview, or if you're really looking at numbers, or even traffic logs from websites, what you have there is a story. You just need to know what kind of story you're looking at. So what interests me is this. So what kind of stories do I have there? What can I learn from that? So my whole point, and then that's the kind of project really kind of gets my attention, is generating new knowledge, understanding new things, piecing together different puzzles. So that's it. And I think, for example, if we're looking at data the way we understand it now as an industry, when it's married with technology, you can do that at scale. You can really kind of probe into different kinds of questions. And I think that's it, because I mean, I go back to a Richard Feynman quote. I mean, the famous physicist last century. There's this kind of snippet of him talking about science and beauty. So it says, yeah, a friend of mine asked me if I don't feel like I'm missing out. He's an artist, he says, and he asks me if I'm not missing out because I can't really enjoy the simple beauty of a flower, right? To which he replies, well, I think I can probably enjoy this flower even more than you, because I not only I have access to the beauty you see, but also I see a lot more things going on under the surface that really kind of is a different kind of beauty. And so that's what interests me. So you can really kind of start making these connections and learning all these different things about the world when you marry, when you turn actually all the signals into data and deploy technology to make sense of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I like the point about kind of story, understanding the story that the data's telling you, and I think that's kind of that transcends, I think, lots of different industries, is actually taking people on that journey, and maybe using the data to allow non-techie people to understand the story as well. And that's, I guess, a key part of being able to implement strategy is getting techie and non-techie people on the same ship and taking them in the same direction. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And your role of head of data science now, in the health tech space, I mean, clearly data science is a ever evolving and growing area of life, really, for all of us now. But what are you most passionate about, I suppose, in the world of data science? Is there any particular areas that kind of really whet your appetite?
Oh, as I mentioned earlier, it's the messy problems, the open-ended problems, the people problems. So anything ranging from language, reasoning, and behavior, to be honest. Because for example, in health space, that's a big thing. So you have all these multiple agents interacting with very high stakes. So we are talking public policy, we are talking access, we are talking HCPs, we are talking patients, diagnosis, and the journeys are quite tricky. So I think that would be my like ultimate definition of a messy, complex problem. So it's not something you can really forecast cleanly, for example, because I mean, if we step back, when we're talking about systems like auction systems or forecasting, or even, I mean, if you're looking at to a degree attribution on ads, we're really talking about a game, right? So you know what the outcome is, you know how many different pathways you have there. So it's really about finding the best way to play the game, so the most efficient way. When we have people problems, you can't really solve for that. I think you at best can approximate it. So it means that if you try and forecast what's going to happen, you're probably going to lose more often than not, because it's not really how much you get right, but how much you can afford to get wrong. So that there's a different sign there. So yeah, so this kind of problems, it kind of requires a really integrated and a holistic perspective. So going back, so it's not really about technical approach, the methodologies, or the technical stack. It's also about how you set up the problem, so the conceptual starting point. So, and understanding that you're not doing away with uncertainty, you're just trying to manage that and navigate it. So it's a completely different way to set up how you solve the problem. I mean, it's more like a network than, let's say, it's not a chess player, it's Calvin ball to a degree. So sometimes you don't even know what game you're playing, what are the rules, and the rules can just kind of change on the fly. And how do you respond to that? How do you keep delivering value to all the stakeholders throughout this process? How do you build a stack? How do you build a system that is really resilient and responsive to this kind of thing? And I think, yeah, one of the key things is essentially, so yeah, I love this. So really having to deal with a living kind of system or challenge is something that really kind of engages me.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And like you say, every problem is different. So obviously the way you would approach every problem, I guess, will vary depending on the situation. Do you find there's any kind of overarching sort of repeatable structures that you employ when it comes to, let's say you're working with a business that is, you're kind of involved in setting up a data function from scratch, maybe building a data team from scratch. Are there any kind of approaches or systems that you found useful when it comes to building and scaling data teams that, sort of that overarch multiple problems and sort of any sort of go-to approaches that you do tend to rely on?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. So in terms of teams, it's always good to have a multidisciplinary approach. So more than most teams I've worked over the years, they had different specialties, different skills. So it's just like I don't know, a task force, if you will. So each with a role to play, and I find it's the kind of environment I thrive and the team thrives, and it's really good to coordinate with them. So, for example, for a financial health index, we had economists, we had communication experts, we had people dealing with financial education. So we had all people from all these different walks of life, but approaching this problem from multiple angles. So I think that's one of my go-to. Whenever I have a new problem, let's say I'll branch here. So one, if I'm taking on a specific ad hoc project, it's really about shaping the problems, finding the angles, and then trying and recruiting the people with the skills for that. I mean, that may change depending on the problem domain, right? So if it's financial health, it's one thing. If it's a patient journey, it's a different kind of thing. If it's pure omnichannel marketing, it's a third thing altogether. So the first part of that is really kind of, okay, so given the problem domain, the challenge domain, what kind of skills do I need? That changes, as I mentioned, from project to project. Then, of course, there's the stack. As I said, I mean, the kind of problem I work more often in is, as I said, it's messy and everything. So it kind of points me to a specific set of techniques, to a specific set of stacks and tech solutions. For example, I've been leaning very heavily on non-relational databases. So, for example, purely native graph databases are really interesting if if you're really stressing the connections between data pieces instead of just kind of, counting them or kind of keeping transaction records. So that's one. Second one, of course, I mean, we try to have some sort of lingua franca, and I think this comes, of course, I'm on the R side of the horse here, less Python, but I think for people from computer science, comes from a Python background more often than not, and people coming from academia and other kind of fields are more probably kind of leaning towards R a bit more. But anyway, you can always kind of, but it's still we are having a shared language there. Packages are similar. A lot of the techniques used are similar. For example, we have causal pathway analysis, which we use a lot. I mean, multi-dimensional scaling for this class of problems. There's a lot of effort that I put, no matter what the project, into really kind of getting the data structure right. So there's a big emphasis on governance for me. So these are my go-tos, right? In terms of, let's say, and for putting together systems and structuring the deliverables, of course, you still have specific professionals that are really specialized. So yeah, data scientists, obviously. I think UX designers are really, really important in any team, because I mean, generally I break down a deliverable in 3 components. So one would be the data. So you need to have the basics. That's your raw material. You need intelligence. So that's processing, that's the procedures, that's the algorithms, that's pretty much the kernel of the intelligence you are coding, right? That's where you have data scientists and some developers. And then, of course, you have the delivery system, because I mean, information will only be valuable if it's used by the right people at the right time, if they have access to it. So you really, really need to design for it. So how is this information flowing? How does it get to the end users? And they will often have different focus for the data. So how do you really kind of reflect that on the way you deliver? So sometimes it's a dashboard, sometimes it's the kind of chart you use. Sometimes it's something altogether different, like an app that really kind of really focus on specifics for each one of the stakeholders. So I try to be really agnostic in that, but having this core team of competencies, which are about really kind of structuring the data, building the code to process everything, and deciding the techniques, and then designing the outputs to make sure the information is clearly passed on to the stakeholders. Again,
Cool. Yeah.
very long answer.
No, but that's really interesting. I think that's like a really robust answer, and very logical and methodical, and yeah, definitely makes sense. And I think those kind of insights are what a lot of companies are in this situation at the moment, right? Where they're really genuinely thinking about, right, we actually kind of need to turbocharge our data processes. How do we set our functions up from scratch? So
and I'll tell you that, I mean, that's more of an approach than, because you can start super small and still kind of pay attention to these kind of 3 areas and 3 principles. So you can really kind of, even if you're just a one-man operation, which has often been the case for me, or if you're, for example, financial health index, we ended up having a team between developers, the development team, and the technical committee. We were talking about 70 people altogether. So that's quite a lot. So, but anyway, that kind of approach really keeps me on the right track all the time. So I can always look back to the fundamentals and say, yeah, okay, so where does this fall? And you can scale up or down as needed. So it's not, again, it's not complicated. I think it's, I like to think, I mean, probably I shouldn't be the one saying this, but I have this kind of thing I go back to, is sophistication does not equal complexity. Sometimes you can really, and it pays to be a bit more sophisticated from the go, even if you're starting small, because it gives you a platform to really kind of build on.
Yeah, I totally would agree with that. I think that's a very well made point. And I think the world of I don't know about you, but it feels at the moment, with the kind of rise of sort of chat GPT and all this kind of stuff that's taken over, it feels like the world of data science actually is really having its moment in the sun at the minute. And for obviously a lot of positive press, but also a bit of negativity as well. To my other half, she's a teacher, and obviously we've been having conversations about chat GPT and all this kind of thing, and sort of what what does it mean, you know, for the future of education and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, some really exciting moments that seem to be taking place at the minute. And one of the areas actually I'm most fascinated about is actually the part of data science in healthcare and kind of health tech. I think, you know, with the kind of training models around image classification recognition for diagnosis of certain illnesses and things like that. I think it's just such an amazing use case there for that in a real world context. But you know, from having been involved in strategy and probably seeing lots of different areas where data has been, you know, data solutions have been implemented to you know, improve understanding and advance things. What sort of areas are you, I guess, most, what trends are you seeing, and what sort of areas are you most excited about in the world of data science currently?
Oh man, I agree with you. Natural language processing is all the rage right now, because I mean, we've been seeing the development over time with Google BERT and GPT, and has been around for, I think we're launching GPT-4 shortly. I think ChatGPT is probably still based on GPT-3, right? But yeah, I mean, that's captured the imagination of people, right? For good or bad. So I think that's a very significant trend in the sense that we're moving away from, let's say, very well-defined spaces into this kind of cognitive realm. We've been talking about cognitive AI for a while. There's been a few false starts, but this seems a very interesting moment. Have you played around with ChatGPT yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I've tried to understand. I mean, considering the model, you know, it works on, to best of my knowledge, works on a law of probability of what's the probability of the next word that's coming through, which obviously is incredibly complex, but also quite simple at the same time. And considering that is the logic, it is incredibly powerful in terms of how it works, and incredibly effective in terms of how it works so far. And obviously I've been testing it quite regularly to try and understand the limits and, you know, kind of where its effectiveness you know, seems to dwane. But actually, yeah, it's kind of smashing most things out the park that you give it to do. So yeah, it's pretty incredible. What about you? What have your experiences been so far?
Oh man, pretty much I think the same as you. I tried to find the altered limits. So I had a really straight up conversation about, are you killing my job? So, so what does that happen to AI researchers? And the system's like, yeah, no, there's still plenty to do, AI ethics, and still need people to train. So it's really interesting in that sense. I asked it for some code snippets, and that was pretty impressive, because I mean, the approach was really interesting. Not the most efficient for the given task, but still, regardless, I mean, it wrote the code. I could just copy paste it, and it would have run. But then, for example, for some specific models we're working on, and by model, I mean, for example, behavioral frameworks, we asked the system to build recommendations for us. So essentially, kind of, can you do our job for us? And there was one of the limits, the other limits of the system, because it really, it's all about the common sense. So what's out there, for example, the work we've been carrying internally on one specific product actually kind of found a blind spot and the blind spot is because it's not a high priority kind of piece of information. I can be more specific, but anyway, so HCPs kind of tend to repeat and default back to a position that is not where the science is at this point for, you know, that specific kind of problem, and that would have been a blind spot. So I've come to think of the ChatGPT as the ultimate librarian, and I understand why Google is worried, but I think it's still a far cry from you know, artificial general intelligence. I mean, it's a great retrieval interface. It's amazing how much it can get, you know, how it can understand the context and get you answers, but you really, really need to guide it. So yeah, I think it's more of, I don't know, could be completely wrong. I mean, wouldn't surprise me at all if I was, but it feels like it's more of a Google problem than, let's say, something like out of science fiction like her. from
Yeah.
Spike Jonze's film.
Yeah, exactly.
But then again, I think that it speaks to how quickly things are evolving, the way we can really amass and coordinate information. For example, if we're talking about healthcare space, and I'm saying, if I'm, let's say, looking for outliers, or if I can really prompt it correctly, it could probably kind of retrieve contradictory and vast amounts of information. So I can totally see that being useful. Also, for example, we've seen chatbots being used over the past decade, and they're really lackluster most of the time. So I think, for example, this again is a giant step up. And I figure for us, for data science, that really kind of, if you can access information at that level, one key problem, which is getting the information out to people, probably fundamentally changes, right? Because we again got hooked up on dashboards, which I think sometimes we are, as as practitioners, we're a bit lazy with that. We just kind of throw a bunch of charts and tables in one single page and say, yeah, that's all the information you have. But there's no cohesive story. There's no narrative. So there's no specific answer to a specific question. There's just a bunch of information. You make that what you will. So I think that's where we were falling short before. And maybe this kind of technology can really kind of cut corners in that sense, because it can really make more sense than let's say you thought dashboard, or generic template dashboard would. So again, what else? Can it be used to collect more data? Probably. I don't know. So it's really about the imagination. Early days, but yeah, so it's fascinating because it gives us a way to deal with unstructured information, or it shows the potential to deal with unstructured information that we had only dreamt of, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. It feels like a kind of real big step forward in terms of what the average person walking down the street, in terms of how they interact with AI. I mean, it felt the same way when Alexa came out, and obviously everyone felt like they were talking to a machine. But when you really kind of dug under the surface of the actual model itself, was really quite simplistic. And I agree. We're obviously still a million miles away from sentient understanding and intelligence. But it does feel like say, from an information retrieval perspective, an absolute game changer in terms of how far that's come. One of the things that I was listening to a radio program the other day, and it was a lady who I think was on one of the exam governing boards, and obviously was naturally worried about students that are writing essays for their A levels or whatever. And how basically ChatGPT can be used pretty much to put together an essay for you in about 3 seconds flat. And weirdly, she had quite a refreshing, quite a pragmatic view to it. And she's like, well, look, if this is the world that we're living in now, we need to change the way we think about how we assess people's intellect, and change the way how we assess people in general. Because it's not that ChatGPT is ruining the system, it's that ChatGPT is the system, and that's not going to go anywhere, and we need to work out how we can apply it in the most meaningful way. And I think that's very true. All of the advances in technology that take place, we just need to work out how we can apply them in the best way. But I still feel, like I said, a long way to go before we're at the point where we can call it anything real intelligent. I mean, it hasn't got a sense of humor, because I did ask it who would win in a fight between you and Jarvis from Iron Man, and didn't seem to understand the question.
Fair enough. That's good. That's a glimmer of hope. But I totally agree with the perspective of that commentator. I mean, sometimes we kind of push back because, the problem is the technology. It's not. I mean, it's really kind of, okay, so what kind of assumptions is it breaking? What kind of assumptions do we need to revisit? And even though it's painful, I think it's healthy. So I mean, and again, I think that's the nature of the field. Can I give you a couple of other examples that really kind of get me excited in data science?
Hey.
These are less talked about because I think they're not data science specifically, but I think data journalism, for example, it's something that's really interesting right now. There's a lot we could learn from that. Because, okay, if we move away from, because a lot of data science right now, it's all about the kind of logs we can get our hands on, right? So essentially, we got used to asking the questions, we have data to answer, and sometimes we just stop answering the right questions. So it's not really what we need to know. It's okay, so what is it that I'm allowed to ask, given this data points I have? But I think, for example, the New York Times has been, with its approach to data journalism, has been showing how you can turn the world into a lab, and that's really inspiring. For example, there's one piece they did on exposure to pollution in India, using two kids, and they really kind of they developed some devices so they could, I don't know how we call that, but anyway, so there was no objective information how much exposure you could have as a kid or not. I mean, so they got one kid from a rich neighborhood and another from a poor neighborhood nearby, but all the data you have is aggregate data given the area, right? So how do you go into the detail? So they fitted the kids with some sensors. They wore that for a few days, and it was just capturing the amount of particles they were exposed to at any given time, at school, in traffic, inside the house. And because of their different backgrounds, the difference was massive. So essentially, it was 2 or 3 days worth of data, but capture every single moment of the day. And you could really see how different socioeconomic level, what a difference the socioeconomic level made. Because, for example, the poor kid, they're in their household, they were burning wood to cook, for example, and that was a tiny space, very enclosed and everything, so no ventilation. Whereas the richer kid, of course, spacious house, gas oven. So they looked at the world and said, okay, so this is what we're really interested in. So how does socioeconomic level impact kids' health or exposure to pollution? And they just devised an experiment. They went out there and did it, right? So they actually kind of managed to find a way to collect the data they needed to answer their question, not the other way around.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that should inform our approach to data science a bit more in companies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I never actually heard of it before, but you can totally understand that. If you can, because I guess in the journalism world, you've got to empirically prove what you're writing about, or at least have certain sources of validation before you actually go and write a story. And taking a sort of data-driven approach to journalism, yeah, that makes total sense. And that's actually a really interesting example. On that note, actually, just one of the companies that we've interacted with in the past is a company called Cocoa Networks. I don't know if you've come across them, but they specifically have set out to challenge or solve that particular problem, and that's sort of the use of cooking fuels and things in very poor houses. And I didn't realize this until I had the first conversation with them, but the number of children that die on an annual basis due to poisoning from fumes from just cooking in a small confined space is absolutely astronomical on an annual basis. And they've built a network of they're sort of in stores, mainly in Africa at the moment, but they're in stores, and they essentially have like a network of clean fuel burning stoves. And it's sort of like on a subscription basis that you can get access to, and it seems to be having like massive impact, in solving that particular problem across Africa, and it's being rolled out across globally now. But yeah, that particular story you spoke about there, it's something I wasn't necessarily aware of until quite recently, but it was a huge problem for the majority of the world's poorest nations. So definitely one worthwhile reporting on and bringing to light. And thankfully there are companies out there like Cocoa Network which seem to be doing a great job in solving that.
I didn't know them, but that sounds amazing. Yeah. And
Mm.
imagine, for example, it's fitted with sensors. They can actually track the difference, right? And then you can have data that is really kind of useful at the micro level, so household level, and then you can really aggregate that. I think that then you have okay, that's idealistic but that's where you can have, for example, open data. You can have some sort of public health or public interest kind of license for use, Creative Commons, what it will. So I think there's always this balance between, you know, devising ways to capture this kind of data that sometimes is just around us and we don't see, right? So there's this potential.
Absolutely.
There's something actually kind of McCann Health in London did a couple of years ago. I love the idea. Essentially, they turned street signs into eye tests. I mean, of course, they don't really replace the, eye test you take at your optician, but optometrist, sorry. But again, it's a really clever way to gather data in a real world setting and spurring people into action, right? So sometimes I think as an industry, we tend to think of data as those numbers, locked away in servers or in spreadsheets or, flat files, whatever. But really, if you step back and expand your view, and if you really kind of think about it from the problem perspective, you can see that every interaction around you is an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to collect data. And whether or not you're creepy about it, that's on you, right? I don't know if you remember Google's old motto, don't be evil. So that kind of sums it up. But between the kind of technology we have these days, I mean, it leaps and bounds. And from ChatGPT, which is the model how to process this kind of structured data, right? Because, or at least how to access, because how we process that happens under the hood. So in their case, it's the neural net, but there will be other different approaches depending on the kind of data you're dealing with. As I said, image recognition is an altogether different kind of problem. But if you step back and suddenly, even if you're talking about, let's say, marketing and journeys and patient healthcare, so how you deal with, with prompting, with nudges, or integrating, in case of HCPs, integrating live experiences in congresses, for example, into the overall journey or overall omnichannel arc that you're building, it's suddenly doable. It's just a matter of how you create the conceptual framework, right? So what kind of things are you collecting? What do they mean? What is the model underpinning all of that? And then the world just becomes a hybrid. Right? For example, there's a really interesting company I've had the chance to be in touch with, and they're dealing with AR like many others, but in their business model, one of the key things is they're talking about their wormholes, right? So essentially how you can really kind of layer up all these different levels of reality. And I think, again, it's untapped potential at this point. Of course, technology is not really mature at this level, but how do you measure, for example, things at different levels? Let's say if you're trying to gauge interest, something you can try and do is, okay, so whenever if I go from, a flat representation to an AR object, it kind of, does that mean there's a qualitative shift in interest, for example, that I can track? Can I test for that? Can I establish this connection reliably? And I think, yeah, so there's always this balance going forward in our business. So how do we cater to the needs of the business today, which is, of course, the bread and butter. So we're talking analytics and advanced analytics and all the other sort of uses we have business-wide. Across the business, sorry. But then what are the new possibilities that we should start to build for? And sometimes it's not even, it's not about technology. It's about, again, approach, about the model, about stepping back and say, okay, maybe if I used to assess, just going back to the test, right? So essays were used as a proxy to assess, I don't know, verbal intelligence or knowledge of facts or your ability to really string together things. But maybe once you have technology that really kind of mimics that, what's the next step? How do you step back and reconceptualize that? And yeah, so I think that's the nexus right now. So we're talking trends, we're talking about really, I'd say, unstructured data and our ability to capture, integrate way more from the world than just computer logs and digital breadcrumbs.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I guess that when you talk about advancing technology, it is, in my mind anyway, about how it can help the common person. So ChatGPT is a great example of, actually, it's a tool that the whole world can integrate with and interface with and actually derive value from. And I see that as a positive step forward. But say a lot of people, there's lots of negative connotations that go along with it. But I think all advances in technology in many ways should be about advancing people just generally on the planet, and helping them move forward and advance either their knowledge or their ability to do certain things. And yeah, it's a really interesting topic. But I think, yeah, it's been fantastic to chat with you, Paulo, and I think some really interesting topics covered and some great insight shared today. And one way I like to always end a podcast is to ask for your favorite piece of advice that you've ever received throughout your journey as a data professional, or it doesn't have to be data specific at all. But yeah, is there a favorite piece of advice that you've received that you'd like to share with your fellow person?
Oh, that was a fun question. Actually, there are two that are on my mind quite a lot recently. So one is I got from in one of the projects we had a really reputable scholar on board as a consultant, and whenever things got really weird and we lost our way, he would just kind of say, go back to the theory, which I think is a pretty solid piece of advice, which I always understood as go back to the fundamentals, trust your assumptions or recheck your assumptions, and look at the data from that perspective and that light. So yeah, that's one. So go back to the theory. The second one, and I think that speaks mostly on a personal level, but I think maybe professionally as well, especially given my seesaw kind of career. So I'm always changing and going to places that maybe I shouldn't be, self-taught mostly. But there's this thing, and guy, please, if it doesn't translate too well, because I heard this one in Portuguese, it's don't mistake a sense of urgency for being in a hurry. So, which is again a very solid piece of advice, because you can have a sense of urgency and sustain that for long periods of time, especially when you're dealing with complex either career transitions or complex problems. Let's say projects, you have multiple milestones, and you have to develop different bits and pieces, and they can be really daunting. But when you break it down, you can sustain that and still have the sense of urgency, right? Which is completely different from being in a hurry and rushing things and just kind of taking shortcuts. So I read it these days, and I kind of agree with that. Long term, yeah, short term easy is long term hard. Long term easy is short term hard. So
cool. I've not heard that one before. I like that. I like that a lot. I'll make a note of that one. Cool. Well, look, again, thank you very much for taking part today and being here with us. And yeah, really enjoyed the chat. And yeah, I think a lot of value shared. So I very much look forward to keeping abreast of your movements and your latest developments as time goes on. And yeah, I'm sure you'll continue to be great success in all of your endeavors. So thanks very much again for coming, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you so much. It's been a blast. This, as you can probably tell, I'm passionate about this, and I have loads of opinions. But yeah, it's been a really lively conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
No worries. It's the best way to be. Always have an opinion. Cool. All right. Cheers, Paulo.
Bye.
Take care.